Hey Internet friends! With China being one of the ancient civilizations along with Babylon, Maya, and Egypt, its history is riddled with the rise and fall of competing powers, strict adherence to the ways of old marked by revolution and revolt to bring in the new, and recently a century of shame and humiliation. But crafted from the rubble of a broken society, a new future manifested, a future that experts have claimed belongs to the Chinese. As the red sun rises in the east, a shadow looms over the west, accentuated by the Western media with reports of tensions mounting between global superpowers. While mainstream media has villainized the Chinese threat to the global hegemony, many an alternative media source has praised the Chinese for fighting what they call the New World Order. But is China fighting this New World Order? Are they forging their own world order? Or is China just another actor on the global stage? Well, hopefully you'll be able to tell me after we examine what the media won't tell us about China. In order to understand what's going on with China right now, we must connect the past to the present. To vastly oversimplify and summarize several millennia of Chinese history, Imperial China was once subject to the dynastic cycle. One dynasty fell and was replaced by another, time after time, with a society and culture shaped by Confucianism, under which moral behavior was celebrated. The philosophy of Confucius served as the basis for creating a functioning society. Upright moral behavior exhibited by both the government and the average citizen provided a sense of order that was enhanced by a person knowing his or her own place in a series of hierarchical relationships, and acting accordingly, between government and society, and even between individual family members, particularly between father and son. Confucianism placed emphasis on mutual respect, and if this principle was effectively implemented within the home or even between the emperor and his country, then society would be successful. And for a time, China was successful as a leading civilization and dominant global economic superpower. Well, until British imperialism rocked China. Which brings us to the 19th century, a century that brought about political and social change globally. Western merchants set their sights on China, and what made China such a desirable trade partner was its trade range, innovation, production capabilities, and large commercial ships. However, China wasn't too keen on the Western sphere of influence, and they were wary of these foreign merchants. Thus, they limited trade to certain ports, and traders weren't allowed to step foot in the empire unless in the designated area. All these rules fueled resentment in the barren hearts of those who saw great potential for profit doing trade deals with China. More specifically, it fueled resentment within a certain empire who desperately needed those trade deals to remedy the financial burden of starting all those pesky wars. So Great Britain got a little creative. Well, that's putting it kindly. They started what we now know as the Opium Wars with China, during which the British grew poppies in India, turned those poppies into opium, and sold that opium to the Chinese to both profit and get the Chinese addicted to opium so they would buy more. Opium was illegal in China during that time, but that didn't stop shady merchants from selling those drugs on the black market. China responded by attempting to completely remove the opium from their country by burning it, but that didn't really work, so eventually war broke out, and it didn't end so well for the Chinese. Wait, a government promoting illegal trade and flooding a society with addictive drugs? All to profit and subvert a threat to the empire? Who's ever heard of such a thing? If we examine history as a whole, we'd notice several patterns emerge, one of which being the strong targeting perceived weakness, especially if that weakness possesses something the strong desires. Doesn't matter if we're talking Rome, Japan, or Great Britain as blanket statement imperialists. To rule the world, or at least attempt to, aggressive strength must be exerted. And in the great jungle of greed, bloodlust, and intoxicating power trips, there are predators and there are prey. China's century of shame and humiliation began with the Opium Wars, but things were about to get a whole lot worse before they got better. The aftermath of the Opium Wars resulted in more trade ports opening for foreigners and merchants gaining rights to travel within China, which is how the infamous Rothschild banking family secured their spot there, along with the notorious Rockefeller family with their Standard Oil business. Both families now are heralded as philanthropists. A fragmented and war-torn country meant the spoils of war were up for grabs. During the Boxer Rebellion at the turn of the century, China attempted once more to get the foreign invaders out of their country. The once united China dissolved into regions that became states ruled by warlords. And the tried and true divide and conquer tactics of the enemy became the kiss of death for the ancient imperial dynasty, and gave way to what we now know as the modern communist state. Following the Boxer Rebellion, the former economic powerhouse went into a period of decline, with a suffering peasant class and no clear leadership, creating the perfect opportunity for a new order to emerge. At odds with each other were the nationalist and communist parties of China. The communist side was funded largely by the same folks who funded the Bolshevik Revolution, all sides of the world wars, and even the wars taking place today. But while the entire world was at war during the 20th century, not only was China battling it out with invading Japanese imperialists, but the nationalist and communist parties were feuding amongst themselves too, not trusting each other while fighting their common enemy. A changing of the guard occurred during the 6,000-mile trek of Chinese communists that secured them as the governing system and Mao Zedong as their leader. This was known as the Long March, which harnessed the frustration and enthusiasm of young Chinese to accomplish their goals and push their agenda, the agenda of which was driving imperialism out of China. The People's Republic of China has been ruled by the Communist Party since 1949. Communism is a socioeconomic structure and political ideology that promotes the establishment of an egalitarian, classless, and stateless society, all based on common ownership. And essentially, there is no private property under communism. One of the first things Mao did was take the farms of the wealthy farmers and redistributed that land for communal farming, in what was known as the Great Leap Forward. But unfortunately, it was a great leap forward into famine, as many millions of Chinese peasants starved to death as a result. Despite all that, Mao is still praised by the Chinese government for reunifying China, modernizing the country, and lifting millions out of poverty, though millions suffered and died. What rarely ever gets mentioned is who Mao really was, and with whom he was connected. Hold on to your butts, things are about to get interesting. Remember how we touched on the Opium Wars? A company by the name of Russell & Company was the largest American trading house in China before, during, and after the Opium Wars. The founder was a man by the name of Samuel Russell, cousin of William Russell, an infamous founder of Skull and Bones at Yale University, a secret society and fraternity whose skeletal hand has extended to every corner of the world to recruit global leaders. In 1903, Yale established a number of schools and hospitals throughout China. And guess who was a student there? Commie Mao. Coincidence? Well, let's see if we can establish a pattern of bonesmen in connection with communist China. George H.W. Bush, who comes from a banking family who funded the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, by the way, followed the family tradition and was a bonesman at Yale. He was also the first U.S. diplomat to the People's Republic of China in 1973. Meanwhile, Yale in China was managed by bonesman Reuben Holden, husband of Bush's cousin. When Bush returned home, he was appointed as head of the CIA, later becoming president of the United States, securing his own Bush dynasty. If you think about it, wherever the bonesmen go, wherever they target, death follows. The Gulf War, the war on terrorism, the war in Afghanistan, just to name a few bonesman endeavors. The CIA has been in China for quite some time, and over the course of decades has repeatedly stated that China's growing economy is a threat to the United States. After Mao's death, a struggle for power occurred, but ultimately a leader who was friendly with the West was installed and established diplomatic relations with the United States in 1978. While Mao ensured China's sovereignty by enforcing an autocratic socialist system, those who ruled after him focused on market-oriented economic development. China's open-door policy opened the country to foreign investors, which allowed a sprinkling of capitalism to dust over the communist country. And it's important to remember that despite that dusting of capitalism, the governing body was still communist, as exemplified in 1979, when China imposed its one-child policy on the basis of population control. In the summer of 1989, the West got a full view of communism at work. During the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, the global rift between the East and the West was reignited. And a very public changing of the guard occurred. China's general secretary was forced to resign in 1987, and demonstrators gathered in the square for weeks. Western journalists were also conveniently present, and they documented this alleged massacre with a series of photographs and witness accounts, stating that the party leaders sent their troops to open fire on protesters. The Western media reported these unarmed protesters were promoting democracy and were massacred because of it, though the official death toll was never released. Does that sound like a recent series of protests? A certain spring in Arabia, maybe? The Chinese government had a very different recollection of events, citing armed protesters who were voicing frustration over the economy, not begging for democracy, and they were attacking the military presence in the surrounding area. The Chinese government stated that the majority of the casualties were soldiers, not civilians. Years later, CBS News correspondent Richard Roth, who was on the scene at Tiananmen Square in 1989, said, "We saw no bodies, injured people, ambulances, or medical personnel. In short, nothing to even suggest, let alone prove, that a massacre had recently occurred in that place." So what actually happened during this attempt of political revolution at Tiananmen Square? Did a massacre occur? Or did students led by CIA-trained agent provocateurs protest for weeks, their frustration eventually turning violent? Regardless of what actually happened there, the effects were the same. The violence portrayed and relayed on the global stage drew international outcry. Some of the top Communist Party leaders were forced to step down. Freedom of press and freedom of speech was even more suppressed than before. Within a year, the Soviet Union fell, and the world waited for China's communist regime to fall too. Only it didn't. Between Tiananmen Square and now, China became the second largest economy in the world, being the world's largest manufacturer and exporter of goods. According to one study, imports from China by Walmart, the world's largest retailer and biggest importer, eliminated or displaced over 400,000 jobs in the United States between 2001 and 2013. As of 2018, China owns over $1 trillion of US debt, though the Federal Reserve owns double that, making the Federal Reserve the largest creditor in the world. Though recently there's been a trend of China unloading its bonds. Maybe they decided that US debt was a bad investment. The alternative media has praised China for standing up to the global world order by asserting itself on trade deals and establishing itself as a global force in investments, while simultaneously shielding their population from outside influence, like banning Justin Bieber from China, censoring weaponized pornography, and establishing re-education camps for Muslim extremists. But the mainstream media paints a very dystopian portrait of China, one of rampant internet censorship, worrisome social credit scores like that of the Black Mirror show, along with an alarming amount of cameras and artificial intelligence for its surveillance state, tough crackdowns on public dissidents against the authoritarian government. Not to mention a massive DNA biobank with data on any and every Chinese citizen perceived as a threat, a general lack of regard for human life, and a growing sense of hostility between China and the West, as suggested by recent events like trade wars, tariffs, rampant espionage, as well as sonic attacks on US diplomats that mirror the attacks that occurred in Cuba of last year. As I'm always saying on this channel, while it's interesting to analyze news coverage across mainstream and alternative media, I'm more interested in the information that's being suppressed rather than propagated. Recently, China announced its PETRO-YUAN to rival the petrodollar. While the petrodollar is the standard currency for oil-related business globally, the actual US Federal Reserve dollar is a tangible representation of all the debt the US has incurred as a country, backed by our confidence to exchange it for goods and services. However, China's PETRO-YUAN is backed in gold. China has established trading relationships with its allies like Russia and the supplier of endless oil, Iran, which I am sure British Petroleum is pretty salty about, as they were in Iran for some time but got the boot. The implications of this PETRO-YUAN could have detrimental effects on the US economy, and the multifaceted threat of a gold-backed PETRO-YUAN was made even more complicated with the proposed European pipeline. One proposed pipeline being US-backed and the other Russian-backed. both of the pipelines running straight through war-torn Syria, where foreign infiltrators are currently battling it out. Could an oil war be one of the motives for destabilizing Syria, with the continued war on terrorism serving as the never-ending excuse? If we look to the past, Saddam Hussein proposed selling Iraqi oil in euros instead of the petrodollar in 2000. And years later, Iraq was invaded on the false pretense of weapons of mass destruction. Gaddafi proposed selling Libyan oil in gold-backed dinars, and encouraged others to do the same. And of course, he was overthrown and murdered in the street shortly thereafter. So, looking to the future, how will China fare in their gold-driven monetary revolution? Will they entice other countries to join in their parade away from the dollar, or will they suffer the same fate as those who attempted before them? What do you think, internet friends? Is China fighting the New World Order by taking a swing at the Federal Reserve? Is China forging their own world order, separate from the pack? Or is China a testing ground for the brave new world of 1984, with an infinite amount of distractions and surveillance cameras? Let me know. I always look forward to your comments. Thank you so much for watching, subscribing, and supporting my channel on Patreon. Bye!